From Interfaith Alliance, this is State of Belief Radio. I'm your host, Reverend Welton Gaddy. It's frustrating that we're taping this segment ahead of the so-called sequester deadline, the latest in a seemingly endless series of manufactured budget crises that continue to dominate public debate here in Washington, D.C. and places around the nation. So we don't know the outcome of the March 1st time limit for finding a solution. In fact, we don't even know how serious the problem is at this point. But what's alarming is that the American public seems to be increasingly disinterested in these crises. For example, polling shows that a significantly smaller percentage of people is following the sequester issue than were keeping abreast of the fiscal cliff debate. Some pundits have even labeled it fiscal crisis fatigue. I think they may be right. I can guarantee that special interests with professional lobbyists have not stopped paying attention. But how much more vulnerable does public inattention make government programs for the poor and the hungry? That's a question I want to pose to a respected expert in the field, the Reverend David Beckman, who serves as president for the ecumenical hunger group Bread for the World. David, welcome back to State of Belief Radio.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate what you do. Thanks for having me.
Well, we need to hear from you. You're a voice of conscience for all of us. Since this interview is being taped today, it prevents us from addressing the actual outcome of this week's sequester deadline. So I think we would do well to begin talking more broadly about the ongoing series of financial crises, whether they are manufactured, as some people say, or whether they're real. You and I have spoken before about the disproportionate hit that hunger and poverty programs take in budget cuts. And so let me just begin by asking you, how much worse are things now than, say, a year ago, and how bad are they likely to get?
Well, actually, I'm sort of upbeat, relatively speaking. When the budget debate started, that was 2 years ago, and the House of Representatives voted for deep, deep cuts in government spending, and two-thirds of their cuts were supposed to come from programs that go only to poor people. I just thought, this is outrageous.
Yeah.
And but what was at that time also that the Democrats don't like to talk about poverty very much. Their political consultants tell them if you talk about poverty, you won't get elected in this country, which is, terrible. What does that mean about us? Mm-hmm. But anyway, so the faith community, in fact, rallied in a remarkable way, starting with the leaders of many of the church bodies in this country, white, black, Latino, Catholic, Protestant, conservative, liberal, and then working with Jews and Muslims, too. We urged Congress and the President to form a circle of protection around the programs that are focused on poor and hungry people. And what is really wonderful is that Congress and the President have, with fits and starts and jerks and all that, but they have cut $2.5 trillion from the deficit. And so far, there have not been substantial cuts in federal programs that go to poor people. It's just amazing, really. Yeah. Now, the threat is still there. The push is still on to go after WIC and Head Start and aid that keeps people alive and develop, health aid, medical aid in poor countries. The push is still on that to go after those programs, and the problem of the deficit is not resolved to anybody's satisfaction. So it's really important that we keep the pressure on to maintain that circle of protection. And then, I just pray to God that they stop the brinksmanship, that our political leaders, it's not just our leaders, but that we as a nation can compromise and get to an agreement. Because the brinksmanship itself is hurting our economy, and nothing's It's bad for all of us, but it's really bad for poor people when they can't get jobs.
David, are there, I guess, what I would call charity hawks, the way there are deficit hawks, political leaders and others waiting to pounce on poverty programs as soon as the public isn't looking?
Well, yeah, I would say so. Yeah, sure. There are these over and over again. Senator Sessions from Alabama just came out with an attack on what he calls welfare programs. By that he means, virtually every program that helps low and middle class people. So there are charity hawks. That's a good word. I hadn't heard it before. A lot of them are. It's not always that they're mean people. Sometimes people think, well, the churches ought to do that, or charities ought to do that. But if you just look at the numbers, virtually every church and synagogue and mosque in the country is taking up collections of food. Mm-hmm. And we've got this huge network of food banks and food pantries and soup kitchens. All of that food charity together is equivalent to 5% of the food assistance that poor people get from the government in our country through food stamps and WIC and school lunches, school breakfasts. 5% is charity. So if you really want to help poor people, that charity is important. And it's delivered with personal care, especially to people when they first fall into poverty. They need help today. But you also, if you care about hungry and poor people, we also have to pay attention to what Congress and the President are doing. Because, it's just so easy for them to take a decision that wipes out the effect of all of our charity.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that frustrates me in that regard is when the rhetoric focuses on what a tiny percentage of the federal budget is subject to the kind of cuts being discussed in the fiscal cliff or sequester debates, because the truth is, you know it better than anybody, that a vast majority of budget items are exempt from these kinds of cuts. So it's actually a vastly larger percentage of a small number of programs that are vulnerable. Is that accurate as you see it?
That's right. And I think it's very clear that in order to deal with they've cut $2.5 trillion from deficits, but they probably have to cut another $1.25 trillion, and that's not easy to do. It's not easy for a family to cut back, let alone a big nation like this, where people have different ideas about what's important. But to get the remainder of the deficit reduction, the way they can do that is first in the tax code. Privileged people, special interests get a lot of advantages in our tax regulations, and it makes the tax regulations way too complicated for anybody's good. So by simplifying taxes at the same time they can raise taxes for people who can afford it, that's got to be part of the solution. Mm-hmm. It's just the math. It's got to be part of the solution. If you don't do that, you're going to take food away from hungry kids. The other piece is that there are spending programs that benefit special interests, like direct payments to agribusinesses. And those can be cut. And then a third area, which is not as simple, but is in the retirement programs, because those programs are huge. And so you can make just really little changes, modest changes in our retirement programs. And over a period of 10 years, 20 years, that results in huge savings. We probably need to do that in order to get the deficit to a level where we're not really putting undue pressure on our children to pay off our debts.
Everything you've mentioned is understandable, it's reasonable, but it is also a hot-button issue among people who are looking at votes in their district and also looking at what's needed.
Sure. So that's why Christian leaders, Jewish leaders, Muslim leaders, and a lot of people of faith all over the country have just, first of all, the basic principle for us is we can solve this problem without making people who are struggling to feed their families, without making life tougher for them. That's the basic principle. And it is, in a country like ours, it is just intolerable that we try to balance the budget on the backs of the poor. So if you start from there, then you look at a lot of other things and think, well, is that as important as making sure that all of our kids have enough to eat, that they all get a chance to go to decent schools and so forth? So if you start from values, if you start from a sense of an abundant God, a gracious God, our own experience of a God who blesses us, if you start from that, then you feel like, well, you can make some tough choices in order to protect the least of these.
And right here is where you, David, and Bread for the World as an institution have done so much good. I wish you would talk about the ongoing work with the Circle of Protection Initiative, because you've been active in this, and I think it has been a great help.
Well, as you know, Bread for the World is a grassroots movement. What really makes it powerful is that people of faith of all stripes all over the country become part of Bread for the World. Local churches, thousands of local churches are part of Bread for the World. And sometimes those churches ask their people to write letters to Congress for poor people in church. So it's the power in our country really is in us. I believe it, that sure, politicians have to raise money, but if the voters back home want something, if even a small group of active people really want something, we do have power in this country to set the priorities of our nation. And so Bread for the World organizes people who have experienced God's goodness to, in effect, be a lobby for hungry people in our country and around the world. And it works. This year, Welton, we're just now starting a new campaign that we call A Place at the Table. Every year we take up an offering for hungry people, and it's not an offering of money, it's an offering of letters to Congress. And so this year we're asking people to do three things. Stay in touch with their members of Congress about maintaining the circle of protection around programs focused on hungry and poor people in our country and around the world. Then secondly, this year for the first time, we're asking people to petition the president to provide leadership. We don't have to have millions of hungry kids in America. And so we can ask him, we can encourage him to work with Congress to, in fact, move us toward ending hunger. It really is quite possible. The State of the Union message had a lot of good ideas. His focus was on strengthening the middle class. But things like Head Start for all 4-year-olds in this country, quality preschool for all 4-year-olds, that would powerfully reduce hunger and poverty in the years ahead. So we've asked people we're asking people to petition him to continue and strengthen his leadership. And then the third thing we're asking people to do this year is go to the movies. We've never done that before either, but a new movie is out. It's called A Place at the Table. It's put out by the same company that did the movie Lincoln and Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. It's called Participant Media. So that's in theaters across the country. You can also get it on the internet through pay-per-view. And it's a movie about hunger in America. And like Lincoln, it's very powerful. It tells stories about real people, makes it really clear that the problem of hunger in America is fixable, and that the main way to fix it is to write Congress and petition the president.
Well, David, I can't let you go, though we're almost out of time, without asking you, this past week, you published a moving powerful call for moral action on immigration reform. Religion News Service distributed the piece. Would you talk for just a brief moment or two about this crucial component of the immigration issue, which is not something most discussions seem to ever address?
Well, Bread for the World's focus in immigration is how this is important to poor and hungry people. I mean, first, immigration, my great-grandparents came to the U.S., and it was partly out of an economic motive. They were poor peasants in Germany. They moved out to Nebraska and homesteaded because America was a land of opportunity. So immigration, I think sometimes people feel like it's like a negative thing, but in fact, almost all Americans are immigrants. And as Bread for the World sees immigration, this is part of what God is doing in our time to reduce hunger and poverty. So we favor orderly immigration in a way that is also respectful of the needs of people who are born in this country and that doesn't put those people at a disadvantage. The people who are undocumented immigrants, there's that group of people, most of them are not poor. That's what's encouraging. Even though they don't have legal status, they've managed to get jobs and they're kind of making it. But poverty is disproportionately a problem there. And if we can give them a path to citizenship without spending a dime, I think 500,000 people would come out of poverty because they'd have a chance to get a good job. Yeah. So immigration is a poverty issue, and we're supporting the broad effort. Both parties are involved, a lot of groups to fix our immigration system this year.
I think most people have known about the work of Bread for the World, but just in case there is a listener who wants to learn more and doesn't know, tell them how to make contact with Bread for the World.
Bread for the World's website is bread.org. And they're really great, like on this campaign that we're just launching right now. You can find out about our suggestions about what you might say to your members of Congress, materials so that you can get your church involved in thinking about these things and understanding that citizenship is part of stewardship. From the website, you can see the petition that we're asking people to sign to President Obama, and you can find out how to go to the movies, go to A Place at the Table. It's really a great movie.
The Reverend David Beckman is president of Bread for the World and recipient of the World Food Prize for his work. His voice is strong and respected in Washington, as is the influence of Bread for the World. David, as always, it is great to hear from you. You challenge us. You have the authenticity to speak about this issue, and we really thank you for taking the time to be with us again on State of Belief Radio.
Thank you, Welton. You do great work, too.